I've done a lot of hiking in Washington State, and I've been on some trails that felt steep enough to test every ounce of strength in my legs. The foothills out here can be deceptive. They don't look like much when you first start out, just rolling slopes and forest that gradually tilts upward. But once you're in them, you realize how punishing the climbs can be, especially when the trail tilts into what feels like a straight wall of dirt, roots, and loose rock. That's the kind of trail I was on the day I found out firsthand what a 7.0 earthquake feels like when you're in the middle of the woods, halfway up a steep hill with nowhere to go. The day had started out normal, cool, a little overcast, typical Washington fall weather. The kind of day that makes you think about moving fast, keeping warm, and enjoying the smell of wet leaves and damp soil. I parked at a small pull-off by the trailhead and threw on my pack. Nothing major inside: water, a few snacks, a rain jacket just in case. I wasn't planning on an all-day trek, just a hard push up the foothill, maybe sit at the top and take in the view before heading back. The trail wasted no time in reminding me who was in charge. Within the first few hundred feet, it started climbing at a sharp angle, my calves and thighs burning as I dug in with each step. Loose gravel slid under my boots, and the dead leaves covering everything made the footing even trickier. I leaned forward, pumping my arms to keep rhythm, feeling that mix of strain and determination that comes with climbing something steep. The woods were quiet except for my breathing and the occasional rustle of a bird overhead. It was about halfway up, maybe a mile in, when it happened. I'd paused for a second to catch my breath next to a massive dead log lying parallel to the trail. The thing was huge, the kind of fallen tree that must have been decades old before it toppled. Now covered in moss, bark peeling back in rough strips. I leaned slightly to the side, planting a boot firm on the dirt while I adjusted the strap of my pack. That's when I noticed it. The log was shaking. At first, it didn't register. It was subtle, just a faint vibration, like something heavy was moving deep inside it. My first thought was an animal, maybe something burrowing through the rotted wood, or something on the other side banging against it. But then the dirt beneath my boots shivered. The ground itself was moving. I froze, my brain lagging behind my senses. For a split second, my instinct was confusion. What the hell was happening? Then it clicked. Earthquake. I've read about earthquakes all my life, heard stories, seen the aftermath in news footage. But nothing prepares you for the reality of it, especially when you're standing in the middle of a forest on the side of a steep hill. The one thing you never question, the solid ground beneath your feet, was suddenly alive, shifting, rippling. It was so unnatural that my body didn't know how to react at first. The vibrations grew fast. The earth groaned beneath me, the slope swaying like something alive. My boots slipped slightly, gravel and dirt sliding as the trail shifted. I spread my stance wide, knees bent, arms out instinctively to balance as the world rolled. The log beside me shook harder, rattling against the dirt. Time slowed to this surreal crawl. My mind raced in jagged bursts. How strong is this? How long will it last? Is this the big one they're always warning about? I had no answers. I only had the sharp realization that I was in one of the worst places possible for an earthquake. On a steep incline, surrounded by tall trees, loose dirt, and deadfall just waiting to come down. The quake built into a rhythm, waves rolling under my feet, the ground heaving and buckling like it wanted to throw me off. My legs trembled, not from fear but from the effort of keeping balance while the earth itself tried to slide me down the trail. I could hear it, too, a low rumbling, like distant thunder but coming from beneath instead of the sky. The forest around me groaned and creaked as trunks flexed, roots strained, and branches rattled violently against each other. Then came the real danger. As the shaking peaked, debris started falling. Small branches cracked off overhead, raining down through the thinning canopy. Dead limbs that had been waiting for the slightest push gave way, tumbling to the ground with sharp snaps. I ducked instinctively, arms over my head, heart hammering. A thick limb the size of my arm crashed a few feet away, bouncing down the slope before vanishing into the brush. The forest sounded alive in a terrifying way. Trees grinding, snapping, leaves thrashing in every direction. It felt like forever, but later I guessed it must have lasted about 30 seconds. 30 seconds of holding my ground while the earth writhed. 30 seconds of wondering if the slope would collapse beneath me, if a tree would snap and crush me where I stood, if this was the moment everything I knew turned inside out. And then, as sudden as it began, it stopped. The ground stilled, the vibrations easing into silence. The forest, too, went quiet, except for a few branches settling and the faint echo of falling debris farther down the slope. My body shook uncontrollably now, not from the quake but from the release of adrenaline. My chest heaved, breath ragged, arms still raised defensively as if the next wave might come. I stayed frozen for another minute, waiting, half expecting the earth to roar back to life. When it didn't, I lowered my arms, flexing my hands to shake the stiffness. The trail around me looked the same but different. The log lay still again, but now it seemed ominous, like the stillness could betray me at any second. Small branches littered the dirt, fresh breaks still green at the ends. The silence had weight to it, pressing in after the chaos. I didn't need to think twice. I wasn't going any farther up that trail. Whatever view waited at the top wasn't worth testing whether another quake would hit. My only thought now was to get back to my car, back to solid ground that didn't slope steeply into the unknown. I turned and started back down carefully, every step measured. The trail I'd climbed felt twice as steep going down, especially with my nerves shot. My boots slid on loose gravel, and I grabbed at roots and rocks to steady myself, hyper-aware that any wrong step could send me tumbling. Each creak of a tree above made me flinch, convinced another branch was about to fall. The forest no longer felt quiet and peaceful. It felt hostile, unpredictable, a place where even the ground couldn't be trusted. The descent took longer than it should have. My legs felt like lead, shaky and uncoordinated, my mind running endless what-ifs. What if I'd been higher up when it hit? What if a tree had come down on me? What if the hill had given way in a landslide? By the time the parking area came into view, relief washed over me so hard I nearly laughed out loud. My car sat exactly where I left it, steady, unmoving, the most comforting sight I could imagine. I threw myself inside, gripping the steering wheel even though I wasn't driving yet, just needing something solid under my hands. My whole body buzzed with leftover adrenaline, the memory of the shaking still alive in my muscles. I sat there for several minutes, letting the reality settle. I'd just been through a 7.0 earthquake in the worst possible place, and somehow I'd walked away. The thing that stuck with me most was how surreal it all felt. One moment, I was just hiking, struggling up a steep trail like any other day. The next, the very ground beneath me had betrayed me. It was more than fear, it was disorientation, the deepest kind, because the one constant you never question had been ripped out from under me. Even now, whenever I think about that hike, my stomach knots. I can still picture the log shaking, still hear the crack of branches breaking loose, still feel the rolling ground under my boots. I know how lucky I was that it ended when it did, before something bigger gave way. That day reminded me of something simple but terrifying. We live at the mercy of forces so much bigger than us. You can prepare for bad weather, for animals, even for injuries on the trail. But when the earth itself decides to move, there's nothing you can do except hang on and hope it ends. And that's what I did. I hung on. And when it stopped, I went home, shaken but alive. I'll never forget how close it felt, how small I was in that moment, clinging to the side of a hill while the ground itself tried to throw me off. I'm glad it stopped when it did. Any longer, and I might not be here to tell this story. Of all the things in the woods, I've always thought people are the scariest. Bears, snakes, even mountain lions, sure, they're dangerous, but there's something straightforward about them. They act out of instinct. People, on the other hand, you can never really know what they're thinking. When you're alone in the woods, or even just far from other people, that uncertainty can sit heavy in your chest. I learned that the hard way one summer when I went hiking alone. I was in my late 20s at the time, and I had been working a stressful job in the city. Hiking was my escape, the one thing that quieted my head. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, but this one turned into something that I'll never forget. It started as an idea for a long weekend trip. I wanted to drive out a few hours from the city to a state forest I had never been to before. It had miles of trails, some leading up to ridges with views, others winding through thick pine woods and valleys with streams. I packed up my gear, just a day pack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, a knife, and a flashlight. Nothing serious since I wasn't planning to camp. I just wanted a long, quiet day in the woods and then a drive back in the evening. The trail I picked was about 10 miles out and back. Not too hard, but long enough that I'd get the peace I wanted. I started out late morning. The sky was bright, the air warm but not stifling, and the smell of pine hit me as soon as I locked the car and headed toward the trailhead. The parking lot was half full, which I took as a good sign. Not too crowded, but not completely abandoned either. The first few miles were perfect. The trail wound through thick forest, where sunlight broke into patches on the dirt path. Birds were calling, squirrels ran across fallen logs, and everything felt alive but calm. Every now and then I passed someone, a couple with trekking poles, a family with kids laughing as they tried to balance on rocks near a creek. Each time we'd nod and move on. Normal trail etiquette. By the time I got to the halfway point, things had thinned out. The trail curved uphill, climbing toward a ridge. The woods grew quieter. The families and casual walkers had all turned back by then, leaving just the occasional serious hiker or trail runner. I paused at the ridge to catch my breath, leaning against a tree and looking out at the view. The valley below stretched for miles, and the only sound was the wind pushing through the trees. That's when I noticed him. He was standing maybe 50 yards back down the trail, just on the bend. A man, probably in his 40s, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. He had no pack, no water bottle, nothing that made sense for a long hike. He wasn't walking either. He was just standing there, facing my direction. At first, I figured maybe he was just taking a break like me, but the way he stood didn't look right. He wasn't leaning on anything, not catching his breath, not looking at the view. He was just watching. I told myself not to overthink it. People stop on trails all the time. I tightened the straps on my pack and started walking again, heading farther along the ridge. Every so often I glanced back, and each time I did, he was still there. Not always in the same spot, but close. He wasn't moving fast, but he was definitely following. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to change. The woods, once calming, started to feel like they were pressing in. The silence grew heavier. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet. I kept a steady pace, trying not to look over my shoulder too much, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was tracking me. After another mile or so, I stopped at a fork in the trail where a small sign pointed toward a loop. I bent down, pretending to tie my shoe, and used the chance to listen. Sure enough, after about a minute, I heard the crunch of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, closing the distance. I stood up quickly and started down the loop trail, hoping maybe to lose him if I moved fast enough. My heart was pounding now, each step making me feel more exposed. I didn't want to run yet. I didn't want to make it obvious that I knew he was there, but I walked as fast as I could without breaking into a jog. The loop twisted through thicker woods, the trail narrowing as it dropped into a shallow ravine. The shadows grew darker here, and the air cooler. My breathing was loud in my ears, but underneath it, I swore I could hear his footsteps too. Every time I stopped to listen, the sound stopped. Every time I moved, it started again. By the time I came out of the loop and rejoined the main trail, I knew he was still there. I didn't even have to look. I could feel it. I decided the best thing to do was head back toward the parking lot. It was still several miles away, but the thought of being stuck deeper in the woods with him made my skin crawl. I turned around and started down the trail. It wasn't long before I saw him again, this time much closer, maybe 20 yards behind, walking at the same pace as me. He didn't look away when our eyes met. He just kept coming, his face blank, his arms swinging slightly at his sides. I gripped the small knife in my pocket, trying to keep my hand steady. The trail felt endless. Each bend I hoped to see another hiker, but there was no one. Just me, the path, and him. The last mile was the worst. My legs burned from pushing so fast downhill, my throat dry from shallow breathing. Behind me, his steps never faltered. He never called out, never said a word, just followed, always at the same steady distance. When I finally broke through the trees and saw the clearing of the parking lot, relief flooded me. My car sat where I'd left it, and a few others were still scattered around. I forced myself not to run until I was on the gravel, then yanked my keys from my pack and fumbled with the lock. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I glanced back one last time. He had stopped just at the tree line, standing perfectly still, watching me. His face was unreadable, his eyes locked on mine. For a moment I thought he might come closer, but he didn't. He just stood there, staring, as I scrambled into the car and slammed the door shut. I started the engine, backed out fast, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him step into the lot, slowly walking forward as if he were still following. I didn't wait to see where he went. I just kept driving until the forest was miles behind me. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop replaying it. Every sound, every glance, every step he took behind me. It wasn't an animal or some imagined fear. It was a person. Someone who chose to follow me for miles in the woods without a word. Someone who didn't belong there with no gear, no reason to be so deep in the trail. That was the day it hit me harder than ever. Of all the things in the woods, people are the scariest, because you never really know what they're capable of or what's going through their heads. An animal might chase you because it's hungry or scared. A person might follow you just because they can. I've hiked since then, but never alone, and never without looking over my shoulder more than once. That man's blank stare, the sound of his footsteps behind me, and the way he stopped at the edge of the trees as if he owned the silence. It's something I'll never forget. I was hiking alone in the late afternoon when I first noticed the smoke. The air was still warm, heavy with the dry scent of late summer grass. I had been on the trail for hours, enjoying the quiet, the kind of quiet you only find far from roads and towns. My plan was simple: cover another few miles, set up camp before sunset, and sleep out under the stars. The day had been calm, almost too calm, and I remember feeling like I was walking through a world frozen in heat. Everything around me, the yellow grass, the scattered trees, even the insects, felt dry and brittle, like the land could crack open if I stepped too hard. At first, the smoke looked thin, drifting above the ridge maybe a mile away. It wasn't thick, more like a faint haze against the pale blue sky. I thought maybe it was someone burning brush, maybe a campfire someone hadn't put out all the way. I wasn't worried. Fires start small, I told myself, and most of the time they get handled quickly. But I couldn't shake the pull to see for myself. Curiosity can be dangerous in the backcountry, but sometimes it feels like the only thing pushing your boots forward. So I kept hiking toward it. The closer I got, the more I noticed the smell. At first it was faint, almost pleasant in a strange way, the dry, smoky smell that reminded me of campfires. But the further I went, the sharper it became. It wasn't just wood. It was grass, weeds, brush, the kind of fuel that burns fast and hot. I realized the wind had shifted, carrying it directly into my path. I stopped for a second, trying to gauge the distance. It still looked far. The smoke was rising steadily, but I thought if it was just a small patch, maybe it would burn itself out before spreading. I had no real reason to be worried yet, or at least that's what I told myself. The trail curved upward, climbing a rocky section where the trees were thinner and the grass stretched wide on both sides. From there, I finally saw it clearly. What I had mistaken for a small fire was anything but small. Down in the valley below, an orange line flickered and rolled through the grass. It was wider than I had thought, stretching farther than I could see in one glance. Flames licked up from the ground, twisting higher when the wind gusted, bending the fire sideways as it ate across the slope. It was alive in a way that made my stomach drop. This wasn't a patch of grass smoldering quietly. This was a wall of heat and light pushing its way uphill, and I was standing in the direction it was headed. My first thought was simple: get back the way I came. But when I turned, I realized the trail behind me was lower, closer to the slope where the fire was already climbing. If I went down, I'd be moving toward it. The only other option was up, higher into the ridge where the rocks and scattered trees gave me better footing. My pulse jumped, and I felt a rush of heat on my face even though the flames were still hundreds of yards away. The wind carried it, driving smoke into my chest and making every breath burn. I started walking faster, scanning the land ahead. There wasn't much. The trail cut through more grass, more brush, all of it dry and brittle, ready to go up like kindling. I thought about how fires spread faster uphill, how they chase oxygen, how unpredictable they can be when the wind turns. I wasn't a firefighter, but I had read enough, heard enough warnings to know I was in a bad place. The flames weren't just a distant problem. They were a threat moving toward me faster than I wanted to admit. The smoke thickened as I pushed forward. My throat scratched with every breath, and my eyes watered. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, but it barely helped. The sunlight above was dimmer now, filtered through a dirty haze that turned everything orange and gray. I couldn't hear much anymore. No birds, no insects, just the low roar of fire. It wasn't like thunder. It was deeper, steadier, a sound that sat in the air and filled it like a constant drum. The ground even seemed to hum with it. I didn't have to see the flames to know they were close. My pace turned into a jog. I kept glancing over my shoulder, each time seeing more orange, more rolling smoke. The fire was no longer a line. It was a front, wide and broken into fingers that crawled up gullies and folds of the hillside. It spread like water spilling across a table, only hotter, faster, unstoppable. I tried to measure the distance, but every time I looked back, it seemed closer, like the land between me and it was shrinking. The heat was real now. Even with space between us, the wind carried waves of it up the ridge. My skin prickled with sweat, and every breath stung worse than the last. My legs pumped harder, but the trail felt endless. Dry grass brushed my knees, snagging against me as I ran. My boots pounded against the dirt, and the weight of my pack dragged at my shoulders. I thought about dropping it, but the survival instinct warred with logic. If I lost my pack, I'd lose water, gear, everything I might need if I made it out. I kept it on, gritting my teeth against the drag. Ahead, the trail broke into a scatter of rocks, bigger boulders with patches of bare dirt between them. It looked like safety, or at least a chance. I pushed toward it, lungs burning. My chest felt tight, like every breath was half air and half smoke. I coughed, stumbled, but forced myself on. Behind me, the fire snapped louder, the sound of brush exploding into flame. It was hunting me without meaning to, driven by the wind and the slope. When I reached the rocks, I climbed fast, hands grabbing at stone, boots scraping against ledges. The heat pressed harder against my back. My skin felt like it was being baked. The smoke swirled thicker, dropping low, cutting my vision. I pulled my shirt higher over my face, but it was useless. My eyes streamed, and every inhale felt like knives. I climbed higher, desperate for air, for anything. Finally, I found a flat spot among the boulders, mostly dirt and stone, less grass to catch fire. I dropped my pack, crouched low, trying to make myself small. The fire roared below, filling the valley with a wall of flame. I could feel it climbing, the heat surging up the ridge toward me. The sky above was gone, swallowed by smoke. My world was orange and gray, a shifting haze that stung and blinded. I pressed against the rock, heart hammering, listening to the fire eat its way closer. Felt like hours, but it was minutes. The flames reached the base of the rocks, snapping through the grass, clawing higher. I watched them twist and surge, racing over the land I had just crossed. The air boiled, and my skin screamed with heat. I pressed my face against the dirt, sucking what little clean air I could find near the ground. My lungs convulsed, coughing, choking, but I forced myself to stay low, stay still. The fire swept past, fast and furious, racing upward. The rocks shielded me, breaking the front as it climbed. I could hear it crack and thunder around me, but the flames didn't catch on bare stone. They licked at the edges, hungry, before rushing higher, leaving me crouched in a small pocket of scorched air. My body shook, every muscle tight, waiting for the fire to curl back and swallow me. But it didn't. It kept moving, chasing the slope, leaving me in its shadow. When it finally passed, the silence was worse. The world around me glowed red, smoldering. Ash drifted like snow, landing in my hair, coating my skin. The land I had crossed was gone, blackened and smoking. The trail was a scar, erased by fire. I sat there for a long time, heart still hammering, lungs still burning, listening to the distant roar of the fire as it moved on. I was alive, but the land was dead around me. It was hours before I stood again, before I trusted my legs to move. The air was clearer, but the smell would never leave my nose. I picked up my pack, brushed off the ash, and walked carefully down the other side of the ridge. My throat was raw, my eyes swollen, but I kept moving, one step at a time, away from the fire's path. Every step was heavier than the last, but I knew one thing with perfect clarity. I would never forget the sound of fire chasing me, or how small I felt when I realized I had walked straight into something far bigger than I could ever control. And that was how I ended that hike. Not with the peace of a quiet trail, not with stars above, but with the taste of smoke in my lungs and the memory of fire burning everything behind me. I've spent a lot of nights in the woods, both alone and with others, but there's one trip in particular that stands out in my memory, a trip that still makes my chest tighten when I think back on it. It wasn't the coldest night I've spent outside. It wasn't the wettest or the roughest terrain. I wasn't caught in a storm or lost for days. It was just one of those times when the quiet around me stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling heavy. When the line between my thoughts and what might have been moving out there in the dark blurred so badly that I wasn't sure if I'd get through the night. It happened on a backpacking trip out west. I'd been through Colorado and parts of Wyoming before, and I'd learned that camping there is its own kind of test. The air thins at higher elevations, the temperature drops fast when the sun goes down, and the forests feel like they're holding back something big and untamed, waiting just beyond the tree line. That's part of why I kept going back. I liked that edge, but on this trip, the edge pushed back a little harder than I expected. I wasn't alone that time. I had joined a small group, friends of a friend mostly, who wanted to do a loop through a range that wasn't heavily trafficked. The trail wound up through pine and aspen, and after 2 days we reached a small clearing not far from a creek. It was a good place to stop, wide enough for a few tents, with rocks set in a rough ring that someone had used before as a fire pit. We set up camp in the late afternoon. The sun slanted low through the trees, throwing long shadows, and the air was cooling fast. Everyone was tired, so instead of spreading out, we built one big fire in the center and cooked there. That's not usually how I do it. Normally, I keep cooking and food prep away from where I sleep, but this wasn't my group, and the fire was already roaring. We cooked simple meals, pasta, some meat, a few vegetables. Grease popped into the flames, smoke drifted up into the branches, and the air filled with the rich smell of food. When the light faded, we sat around the fire, boots stretched toward the warmth, jackets pulled tight against the chill. The flames hissed and cracked, sparks rising into the dark. After a while, conversations died down, replaced by the soft shuffle of people climbing into tents. One by one, the laughter and voices disappeared, leaving only the fire smoldering in the pit and the sound of the creek moving quietly in the background. I crawled into my tent last. My body ached from the miles, but I couldn't quite shut down. I lay there in the dark, listening to the canvas shift with the breeze, the faint hiss of dying coals outside, the steady rush of water in the distance. I didn't have food in the tent. That's one rule I never break. But I knew the smoke from cooking had settled into my clothes, into the fabric of my pack, maybe even into my hair. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke. At first, I thought it was nothing, just my body shifting on the thin pad beneath me, maybe a dream tugging me halfway out of sleep. But then I heard it, a sound that was too deliberate, too heavy to be my imagination. A twig snapping, the soft crush of weight against damp earth. I froze, every muscle in my body stiff. I held my breath, straining to hear. Another step, slow and measured, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Then silence. I reached for the small headlamp I kept by my side. My hand brushed against the fabric of the tent wall, and for a second I wondered if whatever was out there could hear that small sound too. My pulse was hammering in my ears so loudly it felt like it might give me away. I flicked the light on, unzipped the tent just a fraction, and swept the beam across the trees. That's when I saw them, eyes. Two huge, glowing orbs reflecting back at me from the willows near the creek. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stared, locked on the circle of light. For a moment I thought bear. It made sense. Big, curious, maybe drawn by the smell of food still clinging to us. But the longer I held the beam, the more wrong it felt. Bears usually shift around, huff, grunt. This thing didn't move at all. It just stood there, watching, unblinking, like it was weighing me in the balance. The seconds dragged out, stretching into minutes. My arm began to tremble from holding the lamp steady, but I couldn't bring myself to lower it. Those eyes seemed to bore right through me. 5 minutes must have passed. Long enough for my throat to go dry, long enough for my breathing to turn shallow and ragged. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I shut the lamp off. The darkness closed in immediately, thicker and heavier than before. I sat there in silence, waiting, straining to catch even the faintest sound of movement. That's when it happened. From the same patch of willows where the eyes had glowed, there was a sudden eruption of noise, branches snapping, brush tearing, the thunder of hooves pounding against the ground. A massive shape burst out of the dark, charging straight toward the tents. My heart slammed into my throat. I was sure in that instant that it was coming for me, that the tent would be ripped apart and I'd never get up again. But at the last second, the animal veered off. I caught only a glimpse of it in the pale starlight, a towering bulk, antlers spreading wide. A moose, not a bear. It crashed past us, dodging the tents, and thundered off into the night until the sound faded into nothing. I sat frozen, clutching the lamp in my hand, unable to move. My whole body shook, every nerve screaming. I listened for a long time after that, waiting to see if it would come back. But the forest was silent again, except for the creek, steady and indifferent. The next morning, the clearing looked almost normal. Dew glistened on the grass. Ashes smoldered faintly in the fire pit. But the ground near the creek told the story. Deep, fresh tracks pressed into the mud, wide and sharp-edged. Moose tracks. Whatever it had been doing out there, it hadn't been casual. It had come close. Too close. That was years ago, but I still think about it often. I've read enough to know that mountain lions aren't usually that curious, not like bears. And moose, well, moose are unpredictable. They're massive, powerful, and not shy about charging if something feels off. I didn't keep food in my tent, but I know the odors from cooking had probably clung to me. Maybe that was enough to make me stand out, enough to draw a wandering animal close to camp. What I learned that night was simple. It doesn't matter how careful you think you've been, how many rules you follow. Out there, in the dark, you're never really in control. The forest decides. The animals decide. All you can do is hope you're lucky enough to see the morning. I was lucky that time. The moose veered off. The eyes in the dark stayed at a distance. But I'll never forget the way it felt. Sitting in that thin nylon tent, knowing something huge was standing just beyond the trees, silent, watching. And that's the part that stays with me. Not the tracks, not the glimpse of antlers, not even the charge itself. It's the eyes. That heavy, unblinking stare that held me pinned in place for minutes that felt like hours. It reminded me in the clearest way possible that when you're out there, you're the guest. And sometimes the wilderness chooses to remind you of that fact in ways you'll never forget. I was a few days into a long hike when I first noticed the smoke. It was late afternoon, the sun sitting low but still heavy with heat, the kind of sun that bakes the ground and dries every bit of grass to a brittle yellow. The trail I was following wound through low hills dotted with sage and scattered pines, open enough that I could see across valleys, but not so bare that it felt like desert. I had been walking for hours already, sweating under the weight of my pack, sipping from my water bottle in slow, careful pulls because I knew how far I still had to go before reaching the next reliable stream. The smoke caught my eye first as a thin ribbon rising from the ridge a mile or so away. Out here, it wasn't unusual. Fires weren't rare in this kind of country. The grass, the dry wind, the summer heat. All of it was fuel waiting for a spark. I had seen controlled burns before. I had even walked through places that had clearly burned not long ago. Blackened trunks and ash underfoot. Fires happened often enough that my first reaction wasn't fear but curiosity. I told myself what I had always heard. Small fires weren't a real threat if they were contained, if the winds were steady. That line of thinking made me keep walking. I wasn't heading straight for it, not at first. The trail curved and climbed, and the smoke shifted with the breeze. Sometimes it looked like nothing more than haze against the sky, other times thicker and darker. I figured it was just some grass or brush burning itself out, maybe even something a rancher had lit on purpose miles away. The land seemed too quiet for alarm. Birds still darted between shrubs. Grasshoppers still sprang out under my boots. If they weren't panicked, I told myself I didn't need to be either. But the smell began to ride the air before long. It wasn't the pleasant, smoky scent of a campfire. This was sharper, rawer. It carried with it the edge of burning weeds and cracked earth. I slowed down, feeling the bite of it in my nose and throat. My shirt clung to me with sweat, and I could taste salt on my lips mixed with smoke. I stopped on a rise and tried to get a better look. That's when I realized it wasn't small. What I had mistaken for a manageable brush fire stretched wide across the valley, its orange edge flickering in uneven bursts. The flames weren't high, not like towering infernos you see on the news, but they ran fast through the grass, long ribbons of fire chasing each other in crooked lines. The wind, steady all day, was no longer predictable. I could feel it shift against my cheek one way, then another, carrying smoke in fits and starts. Every time the wind shifted, the fire shifted too, bending toward new patches of grass and rushing across them in seconds. I knew enough to understand how fast fire can move in grassland. The flames don't need to climb trees. They just skim along the surface, feeding on every dry stalk, every brittle plant. And the land I was on was nothing but fuel. A mile had never felt so short. Suddenly, it didn't matter that fires were common, or that most of them never threatened hikers. This one was real, and it was in front of me. My first thought was to turn back, but when I looked over my shoulder, I remembered how the trail had dropped into low brush earlier, thick with dry growth. If the wind carried the fire that way, I'd be cutting myself off. Going down wasn't safe. The only chance was up, where the slope grew rockier and the vegetation thinned. Rocks don't burn. Dirt doesn't burn. If I could get to higher ground, maybe the fire would pass below me. I tightened the straps on my pack and pushed forward. Faster now, lungs already aching from smoke. My boots crunched on loose stone, kicked up dust, scraped across bare patches of dirt. The land tilted steep, forcing my legs into a climb. Behind me, the sound of the fire grew. It wasn't a roar yet, not the deafening wall of sound you hear in massive burns, but it had a voice, a constant crackle, a low, hungry hiss, like static swelling in the air. I glanced back again and felt my stomach twist. The fire was closer than I wanted to admit. The flames had found a channel, a shallow gully filled with grass, and were racing straight upward. They flickered like hundreds of small torches, feeding on everything in their path. The smoke was thicker now, curling around the hillside, turning the sky into a dull copper haze. My eyes burned, and I coughed hard, pulling my shirt over my nose in a useless attempt to filter the air. The climb felt endless. Each step was heavier, my pack dragging at my shoulders, sweat soaking through my back. My mouth was dry, but I didn't dare stop to drink. The heat pressed harder, not just from the sun but from behind me, a rolling wave that chased my every movement. My skin prickled, my hair felt hot against my scalp, and even the air seemed to sear as I pulled it in. Finally, I reached a scatter of boulders higher up the slope. The ground here was more stone than grass, patches of bare dirt wedged between rocks. I dropped my pack, gasping, my chest tight from smoke. I crouched low, pressing my body against the dirt where the air was slightly clearer. I knew enough to understand that the safest air was near the ground. Standing tall meant breathing heat. The fire reached the base of the rocks moments later. I watched it sweep through the grass I had just crossed, devouring it in seconds. The sound was louder now, a chaotic rush of snapping, popping, a whoosh as entire patches flared at once. The flames clawed upward, but the rocks held them back, forcing them to split around me. Heat rolled across my skin, so intense I thought it might blister me even from yards away. I buried my face against the ground, fighting the urge to panic, forcing myself to breathe shallow through the fabric of my shirt. My ears filled with the sound of fire tearing at the world around me, relentless and wild. I could feel the vibration of it through the dirt, the pulse of energy ripping through everything in its path. Time blurred into raw sensation, heat, smoke, sound. I couldn't think about tomorrow or even the next hour. All I could do was hold still and hope the fire moved past without curling back. Minutes stretched like hours. The flames climbed higher, pushing up the ridge, but they didn't catch the rocks where I crouched. I watched them leap across grass patches, bend with the wind, surge upward into more fuel. It was terrifying how fast they moved, how alive they seemed, as if they had minds of their own. Ash rained down, speckling my arms and hair, stinging where it landed on sweaty skin. The air was unbreathable, every inhale a battle. And then, slowly, the sound shifted. It didn't vanish, but it grew fainter as the fire climbed higher, away from me, chasing the ridge line. The heat eased. The smoke thinned enough for me to raise my head. My throat burned raw, my eyes streamed, but I could finally take a deeper breath without choking. The valley below me was black, a wasteland of ash and smoldering stubs. Everything I had walked through minutes before was gone, erased. I stayed there for a long time, waiting, listening, making sure it was really moving on. My body shook with the leftover rush of fear and exhaustion. When I finally stood, my legs wobbled under me, weak from the climb and the stress. I pulled on my pack again, though it felt twice as heavy now, and made my way slowly along the rocks, skirting the blackened ground. By the time I reached the next ridge, the sun was nearly gone, hidden behind layers of smoke. The sky was an ugly red-gray, the light dim and harsh. I kept moving until I found another rocky patch, a place untouched by flames. I set my pack down and just sat there, staring at the scar the fire had carved across the land. My chest still ached, every breath reminding me of how close I had been. My clothes reeked of smoke, my skin was gritty with ash, and my ears still rang with the memory of the fire's roar. That night, I didn't build a fire of my own. I couldn't imagine striking a flame after what I'd just seen. I sat in the dim light until darkness swallowed everything, then lay down on the bare dirt, listening to the silence that followed the storm of flames. I realized then how quickly a hiker can go from calm curiosity to the edge of disaster, how a fire that seems common and harmless can become something that nearly ends you. I made it out the next day, following the ridge away from the burned scar, coughing smoke from my lungs with every mile. But I carried more than just ash on my clothes. I carried the clear knowledge of how small I was against something as simple and natural as fire, and how easily I could have been swallowed by it if I had hesitated a few minutes longer. That hike ended not with a quiet camp under the stars, but with the taste of smoke in my mouth, the ache of scorched lungs, and a memory I will never forget. The moment I realized that what I thought was a small, harmless fire was, in truth, a force that had almost taken everything from me. I was about 7 years old the first time I realized what real fear felt like. Not the kind of fear you get from a scary movie or from jumping at a sudden noise, but the kind that sinks into your stomach and convinces you that maybe, just maybe, you're not going to make it out of a situation. It started on what I thought would be just another normal summer afternoon in my neighborhood. The kind of day where kids ride bikes up and down the street, climb trees in backyards, and come home dirty and sunburned without a care in the world. The woods behind my house had always been there, a backdrop to my childhood. Tall trees with thick leaves, winding trails that I sometimes saw joggers use, and a handful of dirt paths kids like me used to cut through when playing hide and seek. I never thought much about them. To me, they were just part of the scenery, somewhere close but still mysterious. I had never gone deep into them, not more than a few minutes in, because my parents always warned me not to. I'd see other kids dart into the tree line sometimes, hear them yell and laugh from somewhere inside, but I never followed for long. I was young and I listened most of the time. That afternoon, though, I was restless. My friend from the neighborhood, another kid about my age, bragged that he knew the woods well. He said he had been through them before, had seen trails and clearings, and could lead us on a small hike. He made it sound like an adventure. I didn't want to be the one who said no. We didn't have video games to play at his house that day, no bikes ready to ride, and the sun was out bright. The thought of walking through shaded trees, exploring somewhere that felt wild but close to home, sounded exciting. I convinced myself we'd be fine. I even convinced my mom. I told her we weren't going far, maybe an hour or two at most, and that we'd stick to the trails. I remember her hesitation, the way she looked at me like she wasn't quite sure but finally let me go. At that age, you don't think about how serious something could be. You think about the fun part, the adventure part. So when we walked to the edge of the woods and stepped under the first shade of the trees, I wasn't scared at all. The trailhead looked easy enough. A narrow dirt path pressed down by shoes and bike tires led straight in. The trees stood tall, branches stretching overhead and blocking some of the sunlight, making the air cooler inside. I remember the smell of it: damp earth, dry leaves, a faint sweetness from plants I didn't know the names of. It felt different from the open streets I was used to, like stepping into another world. I carried nothing with me, no water, no food, no flashlight. I was just a kid in shorts and sneakers, following another kid who seemed confident enough. First, it was fun. We walked side by side, kicking sticks and rocks, stopping to look at bugs crawling on logs, pointing out bird nests high above us. The trees made everything quiet in a way that felt calming. I wasn't thinking about time or direction. I was just walking. The trail seemed clear, and we followed it without question. But kids don't notice details the way adults do. Looking back now, I realize how easy it is for one trail to split into another, how quickly you can be fooled into thinking you're still on the right path when really you've drifted. At some point, the dirt path narrowed, turned, then broke into what looked like two separate ways forward. My friend didn't hesitate. He picked one and we went with it. I didn't think to ask why or how he knew it was the right one. I just followed. Time moved differently out there. An hour felt shorter than it was. We walked and walked, and after a while the trail didn't look as worn down. The dirt path became patches of grass and leaves, and the trees pressed in closer. I thought maybe that was just part of it, that it would open again soon. But it didn't. The deeper we went, the less sure I felt. It wasn't until a couple of hours later that it hit us. We were lost. My friend stopped walking, turned around in a slow circle, and admitted he didn't recognize anything. The trees all looked the same: straight trunks, green leaves, scattered brush at the base. There was no landmark to hold on to, no sign, no fence, nothing. Just more woods stretching out in every direction. At 7 years old, the idea of being lost isn't something you process logically. It's not like I thought about maps or compasses or retracing steps. The thought was simple and blunt. We don't know where we are. And with that thought came the panic. My chest felt tight, my stomach twisted. Suddenly the air that had felt cool and refreshing felt heavy, pressing down on me with every breath. I remember looking at the ground and realizing I couldn't even tell which way our footprints went. The leaves and dirt looked disturbed everywhere. The solution, as it made sense to us then, was to just keep walking. Maybe if we wandered enough, we'd get lucky and find our way back to the entrance. That was the logic of kids, simple and desperate. So that's what we did. The hours after that blurred into a haze of endless walking. The woods were thick, shadows stretching longer as the sun dropped lower. I could feel the shift in the air as the day slid toward evening. The warmth faded, replaced by cooler drafts that slipped through the trees. Every time I looked up, I could see the sky through the canopy, dimming by slow degrees. I kept thinking we'd find something familiar, a bend in the trail, the sound of cars, a glimpse of houses, but all we found was more forest. With each hour, my panic grew. I stopped paying attention to the little things: no more bugs, no more birds. My ears strained for sounds of the outside world, but all I heard was the crunch of our sneakers on leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, the occasional call of some bird far away. I began to think about my family, about my mom waiting at home, expecting me back soon. I thought about the warnings I'd ignored, the way I had told her it would be fine. The guilt hit me even before the fear fully did. I felt stupid. I felt like I had ruined everything. As the sun began to set, the forest changed in a way that terrified me. The colors drained from the trees, shadows stretched long and merged together. The air cooled quickly, the kind of chill that sinks into your arms and legs when you're in shorts and a t-shirt. My stomach growled. My throat was dry. I hadn't even thought about food or water when I left the house, and now it was all I could think about. But the fear outweighed hunger or thirst. The fear was that I would never see my family again, that I would never find my way out. The panic became overwhelming. Every tree looked like the last. Every step forward felt like a mistake. I remember thinking about how big the woods must actually be, how endless it felt from the inside. My mind went to dark places. Sleeping out there alone, getting colder and colder, not having anything to eat, not knowing which way was safe. At 7 years old, those thoughts felt like the end. I cried quietly to myself as I walked, wiping my face with the back of my hand, trying not to let my friend see how scared I was, though I knew he was just as scared. When the sun finally dropped below the trees, and the sky turned that deep blue that comes just before darkness, my panic hit its peak. I thought we were done. I thought that was it, that we were going to spend the night out there with no way out. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. My legs felt heavy, but I kept walking because stopping felt worse. And then, by pure luck, we saw someone. A man appeared on the trail ahead, just a silhouette at first against the fading light. He carried a small pack, moved with the steady pace of someone who knew where he was going. He wasn't another lost kid. He was calm, in control, and for the first time in hours, I felt something other than panic. Relief crashed over me so hard it made me dizzy. He had a map. He had a flashlight. He knew the trails, and he wasn't lost. He led us back, step by step, through the darkening woods. The walk felt like forever, but with every turn, I could feel we were closer to safety. Finally, the trees opened, and I saw the glow of the streetlights near my house. That sight was burned into me. It was like stepping from another world back into my own, like waking up from a nightmare. When I walked through the door of my house, my mom's face was a mix of fury and relief. She was seconds away from calling the police. I had never seen her so angry, but beneath the anger, I knew it was fear. I had scared her almost as much as I had scared myself. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of the woods closing in, the panic of being lost, the cold sinking into my skin as the light faded. Even now, years later, I can remember that exact sinking feeling in my stomach, that certainty that I wasn't going to make it back. It was the first time I ever understood how quickly things can go wrong, how easily confidence can slip into disaster. And I made a promise to myself that night. Never again would I step into the woods without knowing exactly where I was going, without a map, without being prepared. Because once you've felt that kind of fear, the kind that convinces you you'll never see home again, you don't forget it.